Welcome to another version of profiting from the sale of your baseball cards, the best players that are not in the Hall of Fame. So this ends the three-part series of the Hall of Fame. Previously, we spoke of familiarizing yourself with the Hall of Famers. And then last time, we touched on profiting from the sale of your baseball cards, speculating on future Hall of Famer inductees. And today we'll talk about those who seem worthy but did not make the Hall of Fame. And the background for this and the players we're going to mention comes from a host of different YouTubes and internet sites and so forth that individuals speculated many players who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, but were not, and we gave very strong defenses about why they should be. So whether it was the 10 best players, 15, 25, 30, or even one, even listed the 100 best players and support each one of them as possible candidates. Or other sites that basically address the best player from every team in Major League Baseball not in the Hall of Fame. And then some others even went a breakdown by position, the best players at their position not in the Hall of Fame. And the terminology that's used to kind of suggest these players' inability to get in was many of the blame was put on the committees that basically decide who gets in. So they spoke of these players being snubbed, slighted, or even robbed, close but no cigar, bridesmaid, a bust, long shots, faded, just missed. They speak of them as stars and minor stars and very, very good players. But we have to always remember that when we talk the Hall of Fame, which is 1% of all the 22,000 or more players that have played in the major leagues, that these are not just very good, they're superstars or what we would call great. So we're going to review again why statistics are so important. And these statistics are analytics, but also the awards that were achieved. And many of the players that are discussed really, quite simply, fall short of the greatness of many of the players that have made the Hall of Fame. So some of the benchmarks that are used, and there's nothing, a strong, absolute criteria, everything's black and white, but some of the strengths of this particular inductee comes from the home run. So there's a 500 home run club, but many of the greats kind of fit into 400 or more home runs. Or the hits, certainly it seems like 2000 is the benchmark, but we have numerous players, as we discussed last time, that have 3,000 or more hits. RBIs seem to be kind of have a threshold of 1,500 or more. On base percentage, at least in the range of 340 to 400. A batting title or an average above 300, how many Silver Slugger awards, how many Gold Glove awards, how many MVP awards, how many All-Star appearances, even stolen bases are put into the calculation. World Series involvement, or even the World Series most valuable player. If it's in the pitching realm, it's how many wins, and again, at least 200 to 300, or how many 20-win seasons, how many no-hitters, and especially if you had the ability to pitch the remarkable perfect game, how many Cy Young awards, how many strikeouts in the range of over 2,500, having an ERA below 3.0, or if you're a reliever, which there are 9 now pitchers in the Hall of Fame, which are relievers, having saves ranging from 300 to 400 or more. And we still discuss things that are intangibles, things that are sort of like unspoken, but certainly addressed in the election of these players to the Hall of Fame. And that it's always kind of can be argued that some players never got the chance. They never got on the ballot, or if they got on the ballot, they had minimal opportunity because they didn't get the required, excuse me, 5% threshold to stay on the ballot. So they were on the ballot one time, and at one time they got less than 5% of the votes from the Baseball Writers Association of America, and so they never really got a chance again. And these are some of the things that they say are thrown in as considerations. Where do they play home games? So we see that Larry Walker took a while to get in because they felt that his numbers were kind of inflated due to Coors Field, or someone else got a lot of home runs because they had a shortened right field fence. And then the city one played for, and the fan support in terms of getting voted to the All-Star game. And not just performing for 5 years or 6 years or even 10 years, but performing well their entire career. So even if they had 10 great years, if they ended their career in a slump, and it could have been due to injuries or other things, then they kind of missed out on the possibility of being in the Hall of Fame. How many different teams do they play for? There's almost seems there was an advantage if you stayed with one team the duration of your career. If you played for 10 or 12 teams and you were kind of traveling around, that basically sometimes detracted from your ability to be in the Hall of Fame. Your longevity and durability. Many of the players that we'll mention that should be in the Hall of Fame, the argument why they didn't get in, they didn't play enough years. One case in point is Thurman Munson, who died early and was in the league for 11 years, or some people who had injuries like Tony Conigliaro, or other players that basically like Eric Davis that had cancer and a kidney infection and so forth. Timing of one's career, where is this? You happen to play at the right time where you've got noticed, or you didn't get noticed because there was a strike that went on, if there's a pitcher's era or a live ball era, or the ballot was stacked. In other words, there were so many good players at the year that you were up for voting that you didn't stand a chance to even get a good percent of the vote. And then what they describe as the criteria for the Hall of Fame: integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the team. And this has caused a major kind of problem because of the steroid area and the performance-enhancing drugs. Certainly other drugs can be a problem: illicit drugs, domestic abuse, abuse to family members, wives, girlfriends, as well as gambling. And then compatibility with not only your teammates, but the media. It's the media, those 400 writers that basically are casting their vote. And if you did not get along with them and so forth, this may play a part in how many votes you get. And then, of course, World Series appearances, just being in the World Series, being noticed, then you're part of the conversation for being on the ballot for the world of the Hall of Fame. And what's becoming evident in terms of an argument is something that's very hard for most fans to understand in terms of trying to get a consistent value, a comparison point that's based on more than just one thing in terms of home runs or strikeouts or Cy Young, that put them all together into a formula that we basically call sabermetrics, a data-driven baseball game now. So sabermetrics is the empirical analysis of baseball through statistics used to predict the performance of players, giving teams a winning edge. So it's almost a comparison to all the other players and where do you stand in that continuum. And there's many books about this which you can read. They use terms like OPS, on base plus slugging. How many times does a player get on base through any means compared to their total at bats? And there's a formula for that. And you come up with a number and you can compare and contrast the players who you're looking at in terms of their capability of being in the Hall of Fame. And then there's a whip, walks and hits per inning pitch. Another formula is available for that as a point of comparison. But the big kind of numerical or analytic number that basically is being thrown out more and more in this is what's called wins above replacement, or WAR, W-A-R, which summarizes a player's total contribution to their team in one statistic. And it is really just a way to measure how valuable each player is to their team. What if they were replaced by a utility fielder or a substitute in terms of the value that's lost to the team, and how does that show up in wins and losses? And so taking all these numbers together, then they're kind of put in a hierarchy. And if that player gets scores like 5 to 6, where they're a superstar or very well-known player or MVP level, then they're eligible to really be considered as Hall of Fame. But if they fall below that, even though they're an all-star level player above average, that's not enough to get there. And what we find is that they took this calculation, which some of these sites will say is not that bad, but it's very, very complicated in terms of how they take all the measurements together and come up with this one figure. And so if you're interested in that, we're not going to spend time at this talk going over it, but you can calculate this number for a player of your choice. And you can go to many sites, but these are two that really kind of very user-friendly, lay out exactly how you determine a person's WAR score. And when we look at all-time leaders at every position in terms of the WAR score, you see these players, which of course you would say, wow, these are the best, they're very popular, and so forth. So when we look at all of this data, these 10, 25, 30, 50, 100 players that were snubbed and we look at the players in each team that have played for them that were snubbed, or the number of best players at their position that were snubbed. These are the players that kind of come out in terms of statistically saying, boy, you got the numbers to be on the Hall of Fame. And we start with Pete Rose, and it's just remarkable. When we look at these benchmarks, how high he is above them. It's not just 3,000 hits. He has over 4,000. It's not just some All-Star games. It's 17. He was MVP, Rookie of the Year, Golden Glove, Silver Slugger, and 3 times a batting champion. And then above and beyond that, there's Barry Bonds, who almost every one of the categories he kind of rises above. It's not just in terms of home runs and hits and the awards, MVPs, but it's also the Golden Gloves and even stolen bases. And Joe Jackson, though he played in a different era, but basically the average of 354 and the high number of hits during his career are amazing. Roger Clemens, way beyond some of the statistics of most of the pitchers that are in the Hall of Fame, including not just 2,500 and above strikeouts, but 4,600, 7 Cy Youngs. And some of the players we went over last time had 3 or 2 or 1, and even ones that had 1 didn't make it. So many wins, way above that 300 kind of benchmark, and strikeouts and so forth. And then you have Alex Rodriguez, who's coming up. It's questionable, but all of the stats and analysis that you can have on him. And then we run into Don Mattingly, who's a very popular player, who was just kind of like going to be the next best when he started playing back in 1984. And not only was he a good player and had many credentials, but also after baseball, in terms of being a player, he became a manager who won the Manager of the Year. Mark McGwire kind of kept baseball together after the strike, him and Sammy Sosa, because of the home runs and what have you, and number of All-Star games he is, and having that high WAR score that's above 5. And then even Curt Schilling, who basically has so many strikeouts and with so many World Series heroics and so forth. And finally, Fred McGriff. So we look at all these players, but we can eliminate pretty much all of them for any possibility in the near future because of the steroid era and the performance enhancer, or in the case of Rose, in the terms of Joe Jackson, gambling or fixing games. So we take all those out and we're left with Fred McGriff. And now we come into that area that we talked right from the beginning, and that he's a very, very good player. But is he great? Is he a superstar? And that's debatable in terms of these benchmark numbers. And certainly if we look at the analytics and so forth. And then we have other players that are consistently put out there as their Hall of Fame material. And it's still possible that they may be, because most of these players are not struggling with that history of, of steroids and so forth. But are their numbers that great, or do they have other things that are going against them? So as we look at people whose careers were somewhat cut short, we look at Thurman Munson, and apparently he did not play long enough to kind of warrant that consideration. And then we look at another player who was fantastic for the first 5 or so years and beyond of his career, but had the last 5 years a significant slump. So sometimes he is no longer even considered a possibility, and that being Andruw Jones. And then we have players like Todd Helton, who played for Larry Walker most of his career in Coors Field, where maybe that kind of boosted his average and his home runs and so forth and hits. And so we also have Scott Rowland, who is an excellent player, but is he that good to be in the Hall of Fame? And this we'll all find out as the voting goes on, and either making it during his potential to be on the ballot or afterwards in the Veterans Committee. We don't know. So we'll just look at these lists that, again, are put together and people question, and you can look up either any of the players or look at those sites and see exactly, what the arguments are for each of these players to be in the Hall of Fame. And you can also look for the arguments against why they're not. Many of them fit many of the benchmarks, but some of them are just barely there and so forth. And so we look at these players and we say, who is the next to be chosen on the veterans, or what they call the era committee. And we might say, well, we're looking sort of at Brett Saberhagen. He has a good chance. Carlos Delgado. And since Ozzie Smith made it almost a decade or more ago, that they're looking more and more at the fielding potential, the Golden Gloves and so forth. So you have people like Bobby Grich, and then you have other players that are relief pitchers that are getting a lot of no recognition. But you have people who have great statistics too, but they have the issue with the steroids like Robinson Cano. So we don't know where we're going from here as far as the Veterans Committee, but don't be surprised if some of these end up making it in the future. And we go on to other players that we see, and many of them are well known and very popular. You see some players here certainly are suspected of having steroids and so forth. And the ones that kind of come out here that basically are repeatedly mentioned by the people who make decisions about which players were great and need to be in the Hall of Fame. And you'll see these players, Billy Wagner, of all of them, according to people who are much better at knowing statistics and analytics will say Billy Wagner, Don Baylor, McRae, even Jim Edmonds, and George Forster have the potential to be one of those people that could kind of rise out and make it into the Hall of Fame. Another list of players that are continually thrown out there as possibilities based on their statistics and their careers are on this list. Some of them certainly have potential. Some of them, their statistics are not great enough. Josh Hamilton was on his way to be a sure shoo-in for the Hall of Fame, except his drug problems. And then you'll also see that we have managers on this list, like Jim Leyland, Dave Johnson, and Bob Murtaugh. And so when we kind of look at who has the potential here, we might look at Bertolo Colon, John Franco, a pitcher, Jim Leyland, and even other players like Beltran. So the list goes on. Some of these players probably don't have the numbers or have what's needed to get into Hall of Fame, but certainly were very, very good players that we mentioned again and again several times. And then we end up with this list, and again, kind of diluting it down, but these players have been considered as potential to be in the Hall of Fame. Certainly Joe Carter is a question. Even Dom DiMaggio, Joe DiMaggio's brother, is in the talk. So these are the best eligible players for the Hall of Fame. And maybe there's more you could add to it, because when you think of the baby boomers and the years that they kind of enjoyed baseball as a kid and listening to it, going to games and so forth. And I myself, if I said, okay, who would I think should be in the Hall of Fame, not even considering the statistics, but just considering which players in my mind were my heroes, then I would have said these players should be in the Hall of Fame. And because I grew up in the area around New York, and the Yankees were the team in the days of their glory days, it was like, why isn't Tony Kubek or Bobby Richardson or Roger Maris in the Hall of Fame? And even later on with Mel Stottlemyre. And then there were so many great players, even though they weren't in the World Series, that were on the Tigers, the Dick McCullough, the Willie Hortons, and even the Denny McLeans, who got, I believe, 2 Cy Youngs and also had a 30-win season. Just popular players like Norm Cash and Frank Howard and Ken Boyer and Rocky Colavito. And then if he didn't get injured, who knows what the potential of Tony Conigliaro would have been. But in the mind of a child, these are the players that should be Hall of Fame, those intangibles. And then when I had a second generation come, my son's era, and he was interested in baseball and collecting players, then these were his stars. And it's sad because they all have really the numbers, except for that their careers were cut short or that they got caught up in the steroid era. So so we had the Mattingly and so forth with the injuries, and the Bo Jackson with the injuries, and Norma Garcia-Parra and so forth with the injuries. And then you have a question mark on how is it that Will Clark didn't make the Hall of Fame, or Fred McGriff, which you've already discussed. And yet the others are not going to make it because of the steroids. So this is a group that we say most likely no, but crazier things have happened. So this is just a kind of a case in point of the kind of projecting and prospecting and speculating of which players are eventually going to be the stars. And Juan Gonzalez is probably kind of a player that kind of goes under the radar because he was really had potential, and for a long time when he first came into the league. So he was a rookie in 1990, but really came up in September of 1989. And we have to remember that he was from Puerto Rico and projected to be the next Roberto Clemente. He was actually, which maybe people have forgotten, but he was signed by the Texas Rangers as an amateur free agent at the age of 16. So if you're tracking players and thinking what their potential is, here's a guy that's already picked up by the Major League Baseball at the age of 16. And he starts playing at the age of 19. And so when he comes out in 1990, people are already prepared for his cards, and there were the glove cards and a glove card maker. So we've got representations of Juan Gonzalez in every card that's being put out. And his key card was the Flair Ultra card of 1990, but also the 1990 Upper Deck, as well as the others, including a classic and even the next year Stadium Club card. So when we look at his stats and analytics, we say, my gosh, that's pretty good. He was had a lifetime batting average of 295, close to that 300. RBIs were very close to that 1,500, and his hits were very close to that 2,000 numbers. His on-base percentage was between that range of 300 and 400. He's 48th on the list, and then many Hall of Famers are below that in terms of getting that 400 home run club. 434. He hit 40 home runs 5 times and led the American League in home runs 5 times. He had 2 MVPs, and there's really only a few that have gotten 3 and very few that have gotten 2, and he was one of those. He has 6 Silver Slugger awards, played on the All-Star team 3 times. He was on only really 2 ballots of the Hall of Fame, and his last was around 211, and he only got 5.2%. So he really had another opportunity to get there. But as we well know, and was somewhat verified, so to speak, by Jose Canseco, who was a teammate of Juan Gonzalez when he was at the Texas Rangers, even wrote in his book that he and Juan did steroids together. And not only that, but again, we have the slump at the end of his career, basically due to injuries. So he had some major injuries after he had really 8 good seasons. So about 1990 to 1991, he was a star of the future. And then he had a thumb problem that kept him out of numerous games. And then he had problems with his calf, and then he had back problems. And in his last year with the Cleveland Indians, he basically had a hamstring pull and never played again. So he played 16 seasons, which is considered middle of the road, but mostly it was the prospect of his steroids as well as the slumping of later in his career. But he did have a WAR score of close to 40, but not in that 5.0 or above range. And so he probably will never make it, but certainly if you just look at statistics and look at his success as far as a baseball player, he certainly seems deserving. And again, his cards are basically selling for at best $1 each. And so not as the Hall of Fame, where people tend to be kind of shunned or snubbed or robbed. It's even players that had really great seasons, maybe not their whole career, but a really great season. And in spite of that, they didn't make the All-Star team. So these are just some of the players like Tim Salmon and Rick Porcello or Kirk Gibson or Eric Karros, Tony Phillips, Matt Stairs. I could read their statistics on these particular years, and yet they still did not make that All-Star team and so forth. So we look at the 10 most undeserving Hall of Famers. So when we talk about the people who didn't make it, then we question, how did these particular players make the Hall of Fame? And we kind of look at players like Frankie Fish, who became the committee chairman of the veterans. And while he was the chairman, he got 5 people elected to the Hall of Fame, whose statistics are really not even close to many of the players that are not in the Hall of Fame, but they were all teammates of his and friends. So all those players are questioned, and many of the people who didn't make it, they're kind of put up against those players in terms of why they get in and these players didn't. And then we look at Bill Mazeroski, and again, a great fielder, but then he had a 260 average and barely got 138 home runs in 22 years. Well, I'm not going to doubt that he doesn't deserve to be in there, but look at those analytics. He doesn't seem to fit. You have players like Tony Lazzari and Joe Gordon who have so-so statistics, but they played on those great teams. Lazzari played with those the DiMaggios and the other players that basically were superstars. And because they were on the same team, it's sort of like it kind of moved him into it. And we look at pitchers like Bert Blythe and Jim Bunning. Barely really had those one-loss records that were super impressive. They had a lot of wins, yes, but they had a lot of losses. And then you look at Bruce Sutter in terms of his number of saves, but Don Quisenberry has equal number, and he's not in the Hall of Fame. So I'm not saying none of these players deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, but they're sort of the comparisons of people who don't get in, and they wonder how did these players get in and other players didn't. So we have talked about the players that are banned because of steroids or performance-enhancing drugs, and yet the history, even recent modern history, there have been players banned, and not for life or anything, or not that the players with steroids are banned yet, but we look at some of them. So we look at Sal Magli, who was banned in 1946 for jumping to the Mexican League by the Commissioner of Baseball. And then we have Ferguson Jenkins, who was banned temporarily when he was arrested in Toronto for cocaine in 1980. We look at even Mantle and Mays, which were temporarily banned because they worked as greeters at an Atlantic Casino, and he was when they came back, when they welcome home after that banning on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And then we have the Pete Rose incidents, which still kind of goes on, and the arguments back and forth. I won't get into that in terms of fixing games or gambling suspicions. And then we have George Steinbrenner, which for many reasons was banned for 2 years, and he was reinstated after that. And then you have Steve Howe, who really got 3 strikes in terms of constantly being temporarily banned or threatened to be banned, and finally having been banned in 1992 because of his consistent use of illicit drugs. Marge Schatz, banned temporarily because of her racist and homophobic slurs that she did in public. And then most recently, Jerry Meja, and it's permanent due to his 3rd failed drug test. So there are, and these are not PEDs, these are sometimes other drugs too that are involved. So that there's so many players that probably some consider worthy of being in the Hall of Fame, and they still might be based on the Veterans Committee. It still might be in terms of they take a lesser view of the steroids and mood change. It may be that these players will pass away, and it may be 25 years or 50 years or 60 years before they're basically inducted in the Hall of Fame. But still, it's interesting to kind of speculate on what these players have the capacity of eventually becoming the Hall of Fame. Are they still great? Like one of the most expensive cards in the modern era of baseball cards is the Pete Rose card. So it may affect the value, but it may not affect it that much depending on the player's ability and skills. So if you're interested in learning additional information about the baseball card industry, the history of baseball cards, profiting and investing in baseball cards, or ideas to bring the fun back to collecting, be sure to follow us below. Feel free to view our library of YouTube videos, and please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Also, check out our eBay store, where we have available for sale many of the cards shown on these videos. So you all have a good day. Take the rest day off, and we'll talk to you later.